Good morning. I am going to try and answer the question for you of, can I use that code? Software licenses where you're an end user as opposed to someone who's writing the code and putting a license on it. I'm going to be focusing primarily on looking at other people's code and checking whether or not you can use it. I'm Holly Becker. I'm a software developer at Sauce Labs. We do mobile and web testing as a service. I'm also one of the PyLadies Vancouver co-organizers. As you might have guessed, I'm a fan of open source software. Aside from that, I enjoy books and board games and bird watching. You can find me on the internet as Huesta. Another important thing about me is that I am not a lawyer. I did some research for this presentation. It was fascinating. It was informative. It is definitely not legal advice. If you have any actual legal concerns, you should talk to a lawyer about them, because my internet research is not enough, because licenses are complicated. There's lots of different interactions, there's complexities, there's requirements. Sometimes these requirements conflict. There's unclear definitions of terms. Sometimes these terms are from legal precedent in a country that isn't the country you live in. Much of this has not been tested in court yet, so in a sense we don't actually know how these licenses might interact. This is just a summary to get you started thinking about software licenses and a springboard for doing your own research later if you want to. First of all, what is a license? Specifically, what is a software license? I'm only going to be talking about licenses that apply to code. If you have other interesting, creative, non-code works, I recommend the Creative Commons set of licenses to let other people use them. Licenses talk about what you can do with the code and what you must do to be able to use that code. It allows uses that default copyright doesn't allow, and talks about how you can run and modify and redistribute the code. For example, using it in your project. There are lots of different software licenses. Fortunately, they can be broken down into a few categories with similar rights and obligations. I'm going to talk about these briefly, from the most restrictive to the least restrictive. First of all, code that is not licensed. This is not actually a license. By default, everything is under copyright and is not usable by anyone except the copyright holder, who is typically the author or possibly the company that the author works for. However, you can ask for permission to use this code. In a sense, a license is just like a set of permission that the author has already given you, so you don't have to ask them. This does mean, though, that if it doesn't have a license, you can't use it. And this includes code on blog posts online or on some website you found that was cool. You can't actually use it unless it has a license on it, because it's covered under copyright. Closed source or proprietary code. Generally, you can't use this code, or you can only use it in a restricted sense. Like, you can run the code, but you can't modify or redistribute it. Or you can get the binary, but you can't get the source code to even be able to modify it. This is a little bit less relevant with Python. One of the common examples from this category is a EULA. Yes, I'll click through whatever your terms of service are. I don't care, I just want to be able to run your program. Another interesting example is the Unity game engine, which you can use for free to write video games until you have a certain amount of revenue, and then you have to pay Unity to continue using it, which is kind of an interesting business model. The first of the open source categories is copyleft open source licenses. You can use this code, but you have some fairly significant obligations. You have to keep a copy of the license with the code so that the people receiving it know the terms under which they can use it. But additionally, any derivatives have to be licensed under a copyleft license as well. And now a derivative can be modifications to the library itself, or potentially anything made using this library. In either case, they usually have to be released under a copyleft license. That's kind of the point of copyleft. Copyleft is concerned not just with making software available for other people to use, but also with keeping software free. They don't want open source code used in closed source applications, and the licenses in this category enforce that. Probably the best known example of a copyleft license is the GPL and the closely related AGPL and LGPL. The other category of open source licenses is permissive open source licenses. You can use this code. There are very few restrictions, usually just requires keeping a copy of the license with the code so that people know it's licensed a particular way. Most of these licenses also do things like disclaim liability and may also have additional clauses like allowing you to use patents associated with the code or say that using this code isn't an endorsement from the authors or that sort of things. Unlike copyleft licenses, they're not concerned with the derivatives freedom. They can be used in closed source and proprietary applications, usually with no problems at all. This is a very popular category of software license. More than half the packages on PyPI are licensed under one of the permissive open source licenses. There's also several well-known examples in this category, including the MIT, BSD, and Apache licenses. Public domain. You can use this code. There's no restrictions, there's no credit required, you don't even have to keep a license with it. Notably, there's no copyright on this code. This is the biggest difference to the previous licenses in that it's not actually a license. Nobody has the copyright on it anymore. Licenses work by using copyright to set terms on how you can use and distribute the code. I own the copyright, I can say you can use it according to these certain conditions, even if the conditions are minor and the usage is very general. No copyright means that nobody can set the terms, which means there's no possible license for it. There's also no disclaimer of liability, so if you're considering this for your own code, you probably want one of the permissive open source licenses instead of public domain. Although it's certainly been done, the SQLite database is licensed public domain, which I thought was really interesting. The example licenses in this category offer public domain-like rights for jurisdictions around the world that don't have a concept of public domain. The last category is joke licenses. This is not really a useful category of software licenses. The intent is they're supposed to be permissive and funny, but they end up just being really legally problematic. Like, you can use my code if you buy me a beer. So, I buy you a beer, my company buys you a beer, my coworkers buy you a beer. What if my coworker uses your code and I don't know that? Do I still have to buy you a beer before or after I start using your code? This gives the lawyers headaches, and then they have to go drink beer to make themselves feel better. So generally, you want to avoid this category of license. Both libraries with this license, because they're a legal headache, and you probably don't want to set one of these licenses on your own code because it's somebody else's legal headache. I'm going to talk about a couple specific licenses. Generally, if you're using somebody else's code, it's from one of the different open source categories. So I'm going to look at a couple of licenses from the copyleft and permissive categories in a little more detail to set the stage for discussing how they interact. Starting with the simplest, the MIT license. This is a very simple, permissive, open source license. Pretty much its only condition is you have to keep a copy of the license with the code. The license includes the copyright holder's name, so there's a little bit of attribution going on there. Like basically every other license, it disclaims liability. It's actually a really short license. It's only about 170 words, and it's pretty easy to read if you want to go take a look at it and see what you're getting into. In addition, there's some excellent legal breakdowns online, like going through word by word and talking about what that all means in a legal context, if you want to look into this further. Some of the Python packages that use it are SQL Alchemy, Twisted, and Six. The BSD license is very similar to the MIT license. It's another simple permissive open source license. It disclaims liability. It says you have to keep a copy of the license with both the source code and the binary if you distribute them. There's actually two major versions of the BSD license, the 2-clause and the 3-clause version. The 2-clause is the things that I just said. The 3-clause has an additional clause that says copyright holders don't endorse any derivatives. This seems like a really weird thing to put in a software license until you realize that BSD stands for Berkeley Software Distribution, and the University of California in Berkeley didn't want people making stuff with their software and then pretending that the university endorsed it. So they put this additional clause in the license, and then it became really popular, and now everyone uses it. There's many Python packages that use a BSD license. NumPy, SciPy, and Pandas from the scientific computing and data science side, Django and Flask from the web side are a couple of examples. The Apache license is the last of the permissive open source licenses I'm going to talk about. It's a little bit longer. It's a little bit more explicit about several of the things that the previous licenses dealt with implicitly. It disclaims liability. You have to keep a copy of the license with the code. It's a little bit notable for explicitly addressing patents, and in fact grants the patent rights necessary for running and distributing the code, which is useful in today's world. Amusingly, the patent rights are actually revoked if you're involved in any lawsuits regarding the patents, which is a nice little escape clause they put in there. It also includes a section about contributions back to Apache licensed project are by default licensed under the Apache license, which is something that I didn't see in any of the other licenses I looked at, and is kind of a useful addition. In Python, the requests in the Selenium library use this, and actually the Android operating system is licensed Apache. And last, but definitely not least, is the GPL, or the GNU public license. This is probably the best known of the copyleft licenses, possibly the only well-known copyleft license. It's fairly long. It looks kind of like you think a software license does with all the terms and definitions and stuff. It includes all the things that you're probably coming to expect from a software license at this point, a disclaimer of liability, you have to keep it with the code. Like the Apache license, version 3 includes an explicit grant of patent rights, and then all the things that make it a copyleft license. If you distribute code, or modify and then distribute code, you have to make the source code available. The GPL was written when C was the really big programming language, so the difference between source and binary was a really big deal. So note that this means that if you don't redistribute the code, if you only use GPL code internally, or like for personal use or inside your company, even if you make modifications to it, you don't have to do anything special. It's only when you start distributing it, either giving it away or selling it, that you have to make the source code available. Additionally, if you include a GPL license dependency in your code base and then distribute it, you have to make the entire code base available under the terms of the GPL. Remember, copyleft licenses are concerned with not just making software free, but keeping it free. They don't want you to make something with their code and then not contribute that back to the community. They don't want you taking their hard work, building something cool with it, and then not letting anybody else use it. Because of this, the GPL is sometimes called a viral license, because including GPL code affects the licensing of the entire program. But this is where things start to get a little bit complicated. What's the definition of one program versus two programs that talk to each other? Generally, static and dynamic linking are one program, although there's even some arguments there, and like calling an API over the internet is probably two programs, or like piping output from one thing to another. And in between, it gets fuzzy. And this is where you want to talk to the lawyers if you have a GPL dependency, but you don't want to license your own code under the GPL. There's also two versions of the GPL, actually, version 2 and version 3. There's some really interesting nuances in the differences between the two, but for the purposes of this talk, they're basically the same. Probably the best known example of a project using the GPL is the Linux kernel. In Python world, Ansible is actually licensed under the GPL. Whew, that was a lot to take in. This is the interesting part. Can I use that code? So we're going to be talking about if my project is licensed X, can I use code that's licensed Y as a dependency for the closed source, MIT, as a representative example of a permissive license, and the GPL for the copyleft licenses. And this is where I'm going to get a little interactive, and I'm going to ask you to guess the answer to see how good a job I did explaining it. So first of all, if I have a closed source project, can I include an MIT license dependency? Yes. The MIT license has very few restrictions. You only have to keep a copy of the license with the code and can be used in closed source projects with no problem. If I have a closed source project, can I include a GPL license dependency? Probably not. I mean, there are workarounds to ensure that like your project and the GPL project are like separate code bases or separate projects. You can build these like special separation layers using the LGPL to talk between them. But you're probably going to want to talk to a lawyer because this is where the like one code base, two code base things becomes a little bit confusing. It's possible, it's just kind of a pain. If I have a GPL code base, can I include an MIT license dependency? Yes. For the same reasons it can be used in closed source, MIT license is less restrictive than the GPL. You, of course, still need to keep the MIT license with the code that's licensed under that. Interestingly, the combined work is actually distributed under the terms of the GPL because you have a GPL section, and so the combined work is distributed under the GPL, even though the dependency is still available under the MIT license. I did say licenses got a little bit weird. If I have a GPL project, can I have a GPL dependency? Yep, this is fairly straightforward. Two pieces of code with the same license is rarely a problem because they have the same terms and conditions, so there's not much chance of them conflicting or interacting in weird ways. This one's pretty easy, an MIT license with an MIT license dependency. Yes, double yes, they're the same license, and the MIT license is pretty permissive and doesn't care much. This is actually the one I was interested in and the reason I wrote this talk in the first place. If I have an MIT licensed code base, can I include a GPL dependency? Getting kind of mixed responses. It's the same sort of probably not for the same reasons that it's difficult to include a GPL dependency in a closed source code base. The GPL requires that derivatives be licensed under the GPL. So I could relicense my project under the GPL, but if I want to keep it as an MIT license, I need the same sorts of careful separation to keep the GPL license from taking over the MIT license. The two code base, the same sorts of things that have to do with closed source. Once again, we start getting into lawyer territory. Or possibly just crossing your fingers and hoping nobody cares, but that's generally not a good idea when it comes to lawyers. There's always a couple of things that come up when I give this talk, so I'm just going to answer them before you have a chance to ask them. Can you use code that you find on GitHub? GitHub by default falls under unlicensed. Full copyright applies. You can't use this code. Just the copyright holder has given GitHub some rights to display the code and do other things like forking the code, but that doesn't mean you can use it in your project, unless you're GitHub. Except you still can't, because you only gave them certain rights. So many repositories actually have a license file in them that will specifically license their code base under GPL or MIT or one of the other licenses we talked about or one of the other licenses we didn't talk about. And in those cases, you can use it under the terms of that license. But the short answer is you have to actually check the license, because just because you can look at it on GitHub doesn't mean you can actually use it in your project. And then what about Stack Overflow? The answer for Stack Overflow is it's complicated. User contributions are licensed under the Creative Commons Attribute Share Alike license, which is a copyleft style license for things that are not code. But it's not clear that Creative Commons licenses even apply to code, because again, they're intended for books and art and media and stuff like that. Usually websites get around this by licensing the text of the website under a Creative Commons license and the code under one of the permissive open source licenses. But on Stack Overflow, the code isn't separately licensed. They did talk about moving to using an MIT license or possibly a modified MIT license that removed the copyright holder's name in late 2015 or early 2016, but then community politics happened. And for good reason. On Stack Overflow, you're asking questions and you're getting little snippets of code, and probably the author intended for you to be able to take that snippet of code and use it in your project because they wanted to help you. But elsewhere on the Stack Exchange network is codereview.stackexchange, where people post whole programs and are looking for feedback on them. And they probably didn't intend for you to take their program and use it elsewhere. They probably just wanted to show it to you, and they didn't intend to license it under a permissive license for general use. And they couldn't find a license that worked for both groups. This is additionally kind of complicated because it's not clear that all snippets of code are big enough to be covered under copyright. To be covered under copyright, you have to be original. You have to have an origin. And there's really only so many ways to write a for loop, and it's like, is that copyrightable? And if it can't be covered by copyright, then it can't be covered by a license, because licenses use copyright to do things that copyright didn't intend for them to do. So overall, it's just kind of a weird and awkward situation. I am not going to make a recommendation one way or the other, especially because I am not a lawyer. But I will admit that I use Stack Overflow pretty regularly when I'm programming for inspiration or reference or links to documentation or that sort of thing to try and help me solve my problem. You can go read the entire discussion online if you're really interested. I thought it was pretty funny. I don't know if anyone else is a license geek. So in conclusion, there's a few things that I hope you remember from this. First of all, software licenses are fantastic. They allow you to use other people's code, they allow other people to use your code, and all of this has resulted in the open source community that we're all here for. However, software licenses are also kind of complicated. Permissive open source licenses are really simple and straightforward and easy to work with, and if you just want other people to use your code, which includes selling it, then they're a great choice. The GPL takes a strong ethical stance. It doesn't want code used without contributing back to the community, and if you think that's a good idea, then it's probably a good license for you. But most of all, remember to check the license. Don't assume you can use code just because you found it on the internet. Thank you.